There's a version of you that you have never met. It has never spoken. It has never been seen in a mirror. And yet it has been shaping every decision you've made since childhood. Who you married, what job you settled for, why you flinch at certain words, why you feel like a stranger in your own successes. Most people go their entire lives convinced they know themselves. They don't. They know a character, a curated performance built for survival, approval, and safety. And underneath that performance is someone they have spent decades avoiding. This isn't about self-help. This is about the architecture of identity itself, and why one of the 20th century's most brilliant minds, Carl Jung, believed that almost nobody actually knows who they are. Picture a man in his 40s, successful career, stable marriage, friends who admire him. On paper, a complete life. But late at night, alone, he feels a hollow discomfort he can't name. Not sadness exactly. Not anxiety exactly. Just a quiet suspicion that he has been performing his entire existence rather than living it. He doesn't tell anyone. He assumes it's normal. He assumes everyone feels this way and simply doesn't talk about it. He's partly right, and that silence is exactly where this story begins. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who broke away from Freud to build his own model of the human psyche, spent his life studying this exact phenomenon. He didn't believe people were fake. He believed people were fragmented, split between the self they present to the world and the self they've buried to survive it. He called the presented self the persona, borrowing the word from the masks worn by actors in ancient Greek theater. And he warned with unusual urgency for a scientist that the greatest danger a person faces is not failure, not tragedy, not even death. It's mistaking the mask for the face. Think about the last time you introduced yourself to someone new. You didn't share your fears, your private shame, your unresolved grief. You shared a ism of identity, job title, interests, a few safe opinions. That's not dishonesty. That's the persona doing exactly what it evolved to do. From early childhood, human beings learn which parts of themselves earn love and which parts earn punishment or rejection. A child who cries and is comforted learns that vulnerability is safe. A child who cries and is mocked, ignored, or shamed learns something far more dangerous, that a piece of who they are must be hidden to remain accepted. This is where psychology becomes uncomfortable, because that hidden piece doesn't disappear. It goes underground. Jung called this the shadow, the collection of traits, impulses, memories, and emotions a person rejects because they threaten the image they've built of themselves. Anger, you were taught, was unacceptable. Jealousy, you were taught, was shameful. Ambition, you were taught, was arrogant. Need, you were taught, was weakness. None of it vanishes. It simply stops being conscious. And the moment something becomes unconscious, it stops being something you control. It becomes something that controls you. Here's where it gets unsettling. Have you ever had an outsized emotional reaction to something small, a comment, a tone of voice, a minor inconvenience, and felt embarrassed afterward by how intensely you reacted? That disproportionate response is rarely about the moment itself. It's the shadow leaking through a crack in the persona. Jung believed that whatever we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves, we become hypersensitive to in others. The coworker who irritates you disproportionately. The trait in a partner that enrages you far beyond what the situation warrants. Often, and uncomfortably, these are qualities you've disowned in yourself and now project outward. Because it's psychologically safer to be angry at someone else's flaw than to face your own. But that isn't the real problem. The real problem is what this costs a person over decades, quietly, without them ever noticing the bill. Alfred Adler, a contemporary of Jung's and founder of individual psychology, offered a piece of the puzzle that makes this even more disturbing. Adler argued that much of human behavior is driven by an early, often unconscious, sense of inferiority, a feeling formed in childhood that something about us is not enough. Most people spend their adult lives unconsciously compensating for this feeling rather than resolving it. The overachiever chasing another promotion isn't necessarily pursuing purpose. They may be outrunning a childhood conviction that they were never quite good enough to be loved without achievement. The person who can't stop seeking validation on social media isn't vain. They're a frightened child in an adult body, still asking an old audience, "Does this make me worthy now?" When you combine Adler's compensation theory with Jung's concept of the shadow, a devastating pattern emerges. People don't just hide the parts of themselves they were taught to reject. They build an entire external identity engineered specifically to outrun that rejection. The high-achieving perfectionist, the people-pleaser who cannot say no, the person who dominates every room because silence feels like exposure. These are not personality types. They are survival architectures built brick by brick in childhood and inhabited so consistently that by adulthood, the person mistakes the structure for themselves. And here is the part almost nobody wants to hear. The life built entirely around this survival architecture can look completely successful from the outside and still feel unbearably hollow on the inside. Wealth accumulates. Status accumulates. And yet the discomfort doesn't dissolve because the achievement was never actually addressing the wound. It was covering it. This is where Viktor Frankl's insight becomes essential. Because Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived multiple concentration camps during the Holocaust, discovered something that no comfortable life could have taught him. He observed that human beings can endure almost anything if they believe their suffering has meaning, and that people who had every material comfort could still collapse into despair if their life felt meaningless. Frankl's core argument was that the primary human drive isn't pleasure, and it isn't power. It's meaning. And meaning cannot be manufactured by the persona, because the persona is a performance for others. Meaning can only be located in the parts of you that are real, the parts Jung would say live in the shadow, waiting. Something even more dangerous is happening beneath the surface of all this, though, and it has to do with time. Every year a person spends reinforcing their persona instead of integrating their shadow is a year spent widening the gap between who they appear to be and who they actually are. Jung believed this gap doesn't stay static, it compounds. The longer someone avoids an emotion, a memory, an unacceptable truth about themselves, the more psychic energy it takes to keep it suppressed. This is not a metaphor. Modern neuroscience actually supports this mechanism. Chronic emotional suppression has been linked to sustained activation of the body's stress response system, keeping cortisol elevated over time and placing a continuous burden on regions of the brain responsible for regulation and memory. In other words, the psychological cost of hiding from yourself is not abstract. It is physiological. Your body keeps a ledger even when your conscious mind refuses to. And this explains a phenomenon that mystifies people who have never studied depth psychology, the midlife collapse of someone who, by every external measure, was doing everything right. Jung actually anticipated this. He wrote extensively about what he observed in patients during the second half of life. Individuals who had spent their first decades successfully building an identity, only to find that identity crumbling in their 40s and 50s, seemingly without cause. There was a cause. It simply wasn't visible from the outside. The shadow does not stay buried forever. Eventually, through breakdown, illness, addiction, an affair, an unexplainable depression, or a sudden and irrational decision to abandon a stable life, the unlived self demands acknowledgement. Jung called this eruption. When it happens violently, an encounter with the shadow that the ego was never prepared for. Most people never notice what comes next, because they interpret this eruption as something going wrong, rather than something finally trying to go right. This is the point where evolutionary psychology adds an uncomfortable layer of context. Humans did not evolve to be self-actualized. We evolved to belong to a group. Because for most of our species' history, Exile from the tribe meant death. The nervous system that regulates your sense of safety today is largely inherited from ancestors for whom social rejection was as dangerous as a predator. This means the parts of yourself you learned to hide were never hidden arbitrarily. They were hidden because, at some point, hiding them was adaptive. A child doesn't repress anger because anger is bad. A child represses anger because expressing it once led to a withdrawal of love, and withdrawal of love to a developing brain registers as an existential threat. The persona, then, isn't vanity. It's an ancient survival mechanism dressed in a modern outfit. Watch closely, because there's a second mechanism running underneath all of this, one that behavioral psychology explains with unsettling precision. Every time the persona successfully protects a person from rejection, criticism, or conflict, the brain registers that protection as a reward. Say the safe thing instead of the true thing, and the tension eases immediately. Swallow the disagreement instead of voicing it, and the room stays calm. That relief is reinforcing. Over years, it becomes a conditioned loop no different, structurally, from any other habit the brain automates to conserve energy. Cue, behavior, reward, repeat, until the behavior no longer requires conscious thought at all. This is why so many people insist, genuinely, that they don't know why they can't say no, why they can't sit with silence, why they can't tolerate being disliked, even for a moment. It isn't a mystery. It's a reinforcement history so old and so consistent that it now runs beneath awareness. The same way a long-practiced skill runs beneath awareness. Except this one was never chosen. It was installed. Cognitive science adds one more layer that makes the persona even harder to question, and it's called the confirmation bias of identity. Once a person settles into a self-concept competent, agreeable, strong, easygoing, whatever the label happens to be, the mind begins unconsciously filtering incoming experience to protect that label. Evidence that fits gets remembered. Evidence that contradicts gets minimized, explained away, or forgotten entirely. This is why a person can be told directly, by someone who loves them, that they seem exhausted from constantly accommodating everyone else, and still walk away insisting they're simply someone who likes to help. The persona doesn't just hide the shadow from other people. It recruits the mind's own machinery to hide the shadow from its owner, which raises the real question underneath this entire documentary. If the persona was built to keep you safe, why does maintaining it as an adult make so many people miserable? The answer lies in a distinction Jung considered central to psychological maturity, the difference between the ego and the self. The ego is your conscious identity, the I that thinks, chooses, and narrates your daily experience. The self, capitalized deliberately in Jung's framework, is something larger, the totality of who you are, including everything you've repressed, denied, and disowned. Jung's entire theory of individuation, the psychological process of becoming a fully realized person, rests on a single uncomfortable premise: you cannot become whole by only strengthening the ego. You become whole by slowly, deliberately, and often painfully reclaiming the shadow the ego was built to hide. This is where psychology becomes uncomfortable in a different way. Because integrating the shadow doesn't mean becoming a worse person. It means becoming an honest one. The anger you buried isn't inherently destructive, suppressed, and unconscious. It leaks out sideways. In passive aggression, in resentment, in outbursts you don't recognize as yourself. Acknowledged and understood, that same anger becomes information. It tells you where your boundaries actually are. The ambition you were taught to hide as arrogance, once reclaimed consciously, becomes purposeful direction instead of a compulsive, anxious chase for external proof of worth. The Stoics, centuries before Jung, seemed to sense a version of this same truth, even without the psychological language to describe it. Seneca warned that people who flee from themselves inevitably carry that unresolved self with them wherever they go, since the source of their unrest was never external in the first place. Marcus Aurelius ruling an empire, still returned obsessively in his private writings to a single discipline, examining his own reactions honestly, without flattering self-deception. Epictetus went further, arguing that human suffering comes not from events themselves, but from the internal judgments people refuse to examine. None of them used the word shadow, but all three were pointing at the same uncomfortable target. The unexamined parts of the self do not disappear through avoidance. They only grow louder. Think about the last time you watched someone completely unravel over a criticism that, from the outside, seemed minor. Maybe it was a family member at a holiday dinner, defensive to the point of hostility over an offhand comment. Maybe it was a colleague who went silent for days after a routine performance note. In the moment, it looks disproportionate, even irrational. But Jung would have looked at that same scene and seen something else entirely: a person's shadow being touched by accident, from the outside, before they were ready to touch it themselves. The intensity of the reaction is almost always proportional, not to the size of the comment, but to the size of the thing being protected. This is why the people who react most violently to a particular accusation are so often, uncomfortably, the ones closest to its truth. Not always, but often enough that it's worth sitting with. There is a quiet kind of relief available once this becomes clear, because it reframes what so many people experience as personal failure, the anxiety that appears for no obvious reason, the self-sabotage right before success, the inexplicable dread that arrives during moments that should feel like triumph. These are not signs of brokenness. Jung would likely say they are signs of a self trying to get the ego's attention, a psyche attempting to correct an imbalance the conscious mind has refused to see. The discomfort isn't the enemy. It is, strangely, closer to a compass. None of this means abandoning the persona altogether. Jung never argued for that, and neither does modern psychology. A persona is necessary. It allows human beings to function in society, to hold jobs, raise families, maintain relationships without exposing every private wound to every passing stranger. The danger was never having a persona. The danger was believing you are only the persona and mistaking the mask for the entire face beneath it. Awareness changes this dynamic more than people expect, because the moment a person can observe a defensive reaction instead of being consumed by it the moment they can notice. That's not really about this small thing. This is old. The automatic grip of the shadow begins to loosen. This is not a single dramatic breakthrough. It is a slow, repeated act of honesty, practiced in ordinary moments, noticing an overreaction and asking what it's actually protecting, noticing envy and asking what unmet desire it's pointing toward, noticing exhaustion from constant performance and asking who exactly is being performed for. Imagine two people receiving the exact same piece of harsh feedback at work. One spirals for days, replaying the sentence, questioning their competence, unable to sleep. The other absorbs it, feels a brief sting, and moves on within the hour. The difference between them is rarely resilience in the way people casually use that word. More often, the difference is how much of their identity was already resting on the thing being criticized. The person who spirals has, usually without realizing it, built a fragile persona around being seen as capable, and any threat to that image doesn't feel like feedback, it feels like annihilation. The person who recovers quickly has, whether through temperament or hard-won awareness, a looser grip between their ego and their sense of worth. Their competence is something they do. It was never who they are. That distinction between doing and being turns out to be one of the most consequential differences in human psychology, and almost nobody is taught to notice it. This also explains why praise can feel just as destabilizing as criticism for some people, a paradox that confuses almost everyone who hasn't studied the persona closely. If your sense of self depends entirely on external validation, then praise doesn't feel like nourishment, it feels like a debt. Now the performance has to be sustained. Now the mask cannot slip, because the applause was for the mask, not for the face underneath it. This is a quiet, exhausting trap. The better the persona performs, the more terrifying it becomes to imagine anyone discovering what lies beneath it. The next realization changes everything, and it's this: the goal was never to become someone new. Jung's individuation was never about self-improvement in the way modern culture usually sells it, optimizing, achieving, becoming a flawless, upgraded version of yourself for public display. It was about becoming who you already were beneath the performance, before the world taught you which parts of that person were unacceptable to show. So here is the question worth sitting with long after this ends. If you stripped away every version of yourself built purely to be accepted, admired, or safe the achievements chosen to prove your worth, the opinions softened to avoid conflict, the emotions swallowed to keep the peace, what would actually be left standing? And are you brave enough to find out? Or has the mask been worn so long that you've quietly started to fear the face beneath it? If this kind of psychology genuinely fascinates you, the hidden architecture behind why people think, feel, and behave the way they do, consider staying. There's more beneath the surface, and it rarely stays comfortable for long.